We tend to think of time as something that moves forward, carrying us with it, past, present, future, each moment replacing the next. But what if time isn't something that we just move through? What if it also moves through us? What if time folds, deepens, intensifies, and transforms based on the way we engage with it? When I first came to PCC, or right before, I was in a disheveled state. I had just gone through my first breakup. I was hurt. I felt like I had lost control, a control that I was trying to regain. The I felt stagnant. And that in a way created the reality of my world too. It felt stagnant. On the other hand, I was also excited coming into this program. I was excited to engage with philosophy. And in a large way, it helped me. The metaphysics provided a larger perspective beyond my struggle. I was able to use philosophy and metaphysics as this abstraction from myself. And it didn't initially tie into or translate into transformation for me. It felt like my personal life and my education were two separate realities. It wasn't until I reread Nietzsche, who whose philosophy is entirely about self-overcoming. And that's what life is, self-overcoming, which is driven by an internal will to power. This will to power isn't a reactionary force. It is creative. It does not simply respond to its environment and its external conditions. It produces its own transformations. Now, this will to power, if we understand it as the same primordial will of the universe, allows us to reintegrate with nature through that recognition. This was a profound realization and a point of study when I was in the Romanticism course, where we were observing and thinking about the existential relation between humans and nature. Now, if the will isn't a byproduct or it doesn't act out of reaction or external conditions, then, and if joy also is not found in status but movement and risk and transformation, then these two are inextricably intertwined. Will and joy are more or less the same force. It is not the absence of suffering, but the overflow of power and energy that creates joy. Uh, and to affirm life is to affirm its excess. To and desire is not a desire of stability, but for intensification. So joy is the expression of a life that does not resist its own becoming, but embraces it fully. So rereading Nietzsche shifted my focus from suffering to becoming, to seeing life as not something to endure, but as a process of actively creating difference. That joy doesn't emerge from a lack of struggle or lack or struggle, but from an excess of energy, from desire that does not seek to fill a void, but to create something new. When I came across Deleuze in our intuition course, I saw that he was expanding these Nietzschean concepts to their limits, or beyond their limits, I should say, in the Nietzschean sense. He sees how traditional views of history frame time as a sequence of stable identities that just move forward. Now, he argues that identity is not primary, it's actually the product of difference movement, and transformation. Nothing simply is. Everything is a process of becoming. And we should all know this by the end of our time at PCC. So, Nietzsche's will to power is not a singular force, but a multiplicity of competing and shifting intensities. Instead of a stable self, there's actually only an assemblage of flows and forces that, again, all compete to drive themselves towards production and creation of novelty. And as we said, desire does not seek to fill out of lack. The desire that is tied to the will, that is also the same as joy. It instead produces new realities. So identity is not something that we develop. It's something we continuously escape. To become is not to reach a final form. It is instead to diverge, to intensify, and to mutate. This self is not a fixed subject in history. It's an open-ended process of all these different forces and multiplicities continuously moving. Now, this notion of static being is tied to our traditional problems of philosophy, where philosophy for the last 2,000 years has seen problems as something as things to be solved. Deleuze argues that problems actually create reality. They are the conditions for differentiation and transformation. We shouldn't see them as things to be flattened out and to be linearly solved, that there is an end to get to in a solution. Solutions are actually secondary to problems. Problems are the primary field of reality, but we often mistake the solution as independent. And our tendency to respond to problems out of lack assumes desire is negative when it is actually productive. Desire is tied to problematization, and the will and joy. It is this field of intensity and multiplicity which becomes. So the question should be not what is missing, but how does desire create new life and new realities? And instead of seeking eternal answers, as we have tried to do for the last 2,000 years, we should create new problems that challenge and reshape thoughts. So problems are actually these excess amounts of energy that reveal themselves and transform reality. And it is only by the excess and exceeding the limits of identity that something returns in a new form. Becoming is not repetition of the same, it's actually the return of difference. Behind everything is difference, and behind difference is nothing. To quote Deleuze, he says, only the extreme, the excessive returns, that which passes into something else and becomes identical. So my own stagnation was not something to overcome as an obstacle, although I desperately wanted to get beyond that situation. But instead, through this framework, I was able to see that it was a force that could be transformed into movement. This tension between control and surrender was not a contradiction. Rather, it was a field of difference producing becoming. Back in November, I went to this conference called The Renewal of Science, where I came across a lecturer by the name of Christoph Huyek, who was proposing that evolution is not out of adaptation, and it goes beyond adaptation, as a matter of fact. It, it's not a mere reacting to the environment. It is about gaining autonomy over it. And he sees the human body as the archetype of freedom, where it is the form that actively shapes its possibilities. And this ties into the philosophy of George Bataille, where he sees life as not a struggle to survive. Life overflows with an excess of energy, and this excess is the source of difference, novelty, and transformation. And crucial to their philosophy is this concept of metamerism, which reveals a structural pattern in nature, claiming that or showing that evolution is not just a repetition, is not just evolutionary adaptation. It's an expression of energy's abundance. Now, we can see this in the spinal column of vertebrates, where each segment of the spine is similar to the previous one. However, it is different. It is different insofar that it creates the ideal conditions for the body to move the way for move the way in a sense of autonomous movement. So this segmentation of the body across species shows a repeated organizational principle of life. So it's these movements, this morphology is not an adaptive function, but they anticipate future forms. It's the energy that spills over into the next form. Now, according to Bataille, we said that life's drive to create is not merely out of survival, but an expression of excess energy. And metamerism embodies this excess. Form repeats, not to conserve energy, but to channel it into new creative outlets. And as we said, Deleuze says, only the extreme, the excessive, returns. Now, Carrie Welch's work ties perfectly into this line of study. And I'll bring a quote by her in where she says, organized structures emerge at the interface of difference to transfer energy more efficiently across the gradient. Here we can see that if difference is the key to transformation, then time itself must be understood as nonlinear, folding and intensifying, rather than simply passing. Nietzsche has been central to my philosophy for a very long time, and Deleuze, during my time at PCC, has been the propeller of much of my studies. However, my favorite assigned reading so far has been Carey's Fractal Topology of Time. This book has had a tremendous amount of influence on the way I view time, the way I view my relationship to myself, and my environment. Her concept of collapsing the future means realizing that all possibilities exist within the present. It is reorienting the direction of our desires, not seeing them as something that shoots off into the future, and the future being this container where it contains what we want and desire, but rather this collapse shows that, yes, our desires are actually this infolding of energy where we could see the present as infinite possibilities. Before I came across Carey's work, I would take daily walks in the Panhandle in San Francisco, where I would watch the movement of the trees and their verticular spiral movement and see how the branches would unfurl and the leaves would take place, and see how the canopy of the trees would merge with the next canopy of trees. I would see the trees as not static objects, but as unfolding movements. And I was able to feel the harmony between myself and the environment. Time didn't simply pass. It pulsated, vibrated, and resonated with my experience as I slowed it down. Now, the The way that we actively shape our engagement with time and difference leads to a more expansive and creative life. And by learning to trust time and embrace difference, I have found not only intellectual insights, but also a deeper harmony with my own unfolding life. And I'd like to finish off with a quote here by Henry Miller, where he embraces the chaotic, ever-changing nature of life. And it goes, I love everything that flows, everything that has time in it and becoming, and brings us back to the great ocean of being and becoming and ceaseless movement. I love rain and rivers, lakes and seas, waves, the ebb and flow, the flux of blood in the veins, tides of the ocean, growth of trees, the wind, the rising sun, and its setting. I love the living moment, uncalculated, the random, the brief, the instant. To affirm life is therefore not to resist chaos, but to embrace its ceaseless movement, the endless becoming of difference itself.